Morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're located. And thanks for joining the webinar today, Trends in Identity Security. My name is Julie Smith, and I'm the Executive Director of the Identity Defined Security Alliance. Just want to touch on a few logistical items before we get started with the webinar. First, if you have any questions throughout the webinar today, please submit them through the Q&A chat window, and we'll get to them at the end of the session. We are recording this session, and we'll be sharing a link with those that are unable to make it today, or if you'd like to share it with colleagues who are unable to make it. And lastly, the slides from the webinar today will also be available. Before I turn it over to today's speakers, I wanted to provide a quick introduction to the Identity Defined Security Alliance. The IDSA is a nonprofit organization that facilitates community collaboration to help organizations reduce risk by providing education, best practices, and resources to implement identity-centric security. Our membership is comprised of leading identity and security vendors, in addition to our customer advisory board members who provide guidance on our mission and represent the practitioner community. We deliver on our mission through cross-vendor collaboration, thought leadership, identity-centric security framework, which are vendor-agnostic best practices, security outcomes, and approaches, customer implementation stories, and a virtual community for sharing experiences and validation. So let's get on to the webinar today. Our presenters are Diane Hagglund, Principal and Founder of Dimensional Research. Diane has tremendous expertise with the technology, people, and processes of corporate IT teams. She spends her days gathering practical feedback from technology stakeholders to help her clients gain a deeper understanding of the operational and strategic choices that will delight their customers. Her passion is making data approachable, actionable, and even fun, as you'll find out today on the webinar. Joining Diane is Morey Haber, who is a member of the IDSA Technical Working Group, as well as CTO and internal CISO for BeyondTrust. He has more than 25 years of IT industry experience and has authored 3 A-Press books, Privileged Attack Vectors, Asset Attack Vectors, and Identity Attack Vectors. In addition to his internal role at BeyondTrust, Morey currently oversees BeyondTrust strategy for privilege access management and remote access solutions. Diane, at this point, I'll turn it over to you and Morey to discuss the important highlights of our recent study and dive deeper into the results and implications.
Great. Well, thank you, Julie. It's an absolute pleasure to be here with you all today discussing the results of our recent study examining trends in identity-related security. I'm looking forward, Morey. I know every time I talk to you on this subject, I learn something, so I'm really looking forward to your take on this as well. We're going to kind of break our conversation today into the 3 areas of the research. First, we're going to look at what's happening with identity-related breaches. How often do they happen? What kind of breaches are they? And get some data around that. Then we're going to examine what it is that identity and security teams are doing to solve this problem, to protect their organizations. And then finally, we're going to look at what's the impact of some of the results of the teams who are having some of the most forward-thinking efforts and are the most mature. Now, before I show you the data, of course, we need to let you know where this information comes from. What we're showing you today is based on a survey of over 500 identity and security professionals in the United States. Now, one thing I will point out is this survey was fielded just last April, and so the data you are seeing is very fresh, new, and really paints a picture of what's currently going on with identity-related security issues. Just quickly on the participants, these were a mix of job levels, a bunch of different industries, but when it came to company size, we did really want to examine just the very largest industries. So every participant in this study worked at a company with at least 1,000 employees through to very, very large companies as well. So now that you know where the data came from, let's dive into our findings. So the first thing that we wanted to do in this study was to really examine how common is this? These identity-related breaches are in the news so often, and you kind of can lose track of, is this just kind of some dramatic outliers, or is this something that every team is dealing with? So we asked the question, and we found out that, yeah, this is something that everybody is dealing with. This is a ubiquitous problem. So if anyone on this call has been dealing with an identity-related breach, know that you are not alone. So there's a couple things that pop out when you look at the data like this. The first is that really it's so common. If you look at that tiny, tiny little green bar over there on the right, only 6% are saying that they've never had an identity related breach. So, 94%, it's much, much more common to have had a breach. The other thing you see looking at this data is this is something that's happened recently. We wanted to look at kind of the last 2 years. We felt that that was a very useful cut of the data to make sure we are, dealing with the most modern issues, and found that 4 in 5 companies have had an identity related breach within the past 2 years, including about 1 in 5, 19%, who say it's happened in the past 6 months. So this is common and it's recent. So Morey, let me pass this to you. Does this data surprise you at all?
No, Diane, thank you. This data doesn't surprise me at all. Threat actors today are really looking for the easiest way to basically penetrate an organization. And even the Verizon data breach report that came out this week supports this. The identity or the account and the usernames and credentials behind those identities are the lowest hanging fruit. If we go back 10, 15 years ago, we were dealing with a lot more vulnerability and exploit combinations and flaws in software that led to worms and bots and the proliferation of problems where hackers were hitting systems remotely and gaining privilege escalation. Today, it's easy to do with phishing. It's much easier to go after the identity via other forms of social engineering, and definitely not a surprise to see the statistics this high. But we have to keep in mind that the identity is not only the person. And as we go through a lot of these stats, we realize the identity can also be machine-based. It can be human-based. It could be from a vendor, a partner, and every identity is going to have multiple accounts associated with them. And that entry point, or that statistic that we see on the screen, could be any one of those combinations below contributing to the breach.
Yeah, that's a great point. And it's something we wanted to look at the research. So we're going to look now at, think about the people in this 79% box, people who've had a breach in the last 2 years. So we really did a drill down with those people to understand what's the cause. And as you just said, Morey, we find that the cause comes from many different kinds of credentials that are stolen, and also many different kinds of attack vectors. And so let's look at the first those attack vectors. And when we look at the specific identity related breaches that have happened in the last 2 years, we see 2 things. First of all, phishing, way at the top of the list, 66%, more than twice any other type of breach reported, or cause of breach reported. But I also think, looking at this, that it's really important not to ignore the fact that there's a lot of these other approaches that haven't had quite the impact of phishing, but are still pretty big. Like even the one at the very bottom of the list here with the man in the middle attack, we're still seeing more than 1 in 10 companies have had a breach because of this. So it seems like security professionals can't just say, oh, phishing is the most, we're looking at that. There's across everything that's going on. So Morey, I'm curious on your take on this. Does this data, first of all, jive with what you've experienced, and how does that inform your strategies?
Yeah, it actually does. And there's the easiest way to understand this is to break it into 2 pieces. First, let's consider phishing. There's a variety of phishing attacks that we all face. And those could be the broad stroke ones that everyone gets within an organization, trying to get someone to click on a link, and hopefully no one does. And we generally handle those in the form of training and looking out for malicious URLs or verification of the emails or some subtlety in that attack that the automated systems did not filter out. That's the first class. The second class is those spear phishing attacks, or those whaling attacks, which are going after the individuals specifically, knowing information about them and knowing the traits of the individual to say, you are an executive, I need you to wire money or do something of that nature. Those are the ones that generally get past all of the automated defense systems that we've put in place, and all of the companies that I normally speak to, as well as being a CISO, have done. Those are the ones that cause us the most problems, and those are the ones that I believe are personally making up that higher statistic, because there's no way to train for that. They look so good. The best thing we can do is that trust but verify method of picking up the phone and saying, look, did you really want me to wire that money? Or did you send me that email, even if it's from another vendor? The remaining items on this list, except for man in the middle, really highlight the identity account credential problem. Stolen credentials, inadequately managing them, being brute forced or even a part of a spray attack, really come into that middle bucket of, look, we've got to do better at managing privileges, credentials, and accounts associated with those identities, to the first set of statistics we spoke about. And finally, man in the middle. Look, we see a lot of times that that's theoretical. Look, that could be subject to a man in the middle attack, or don't connect to that Wi-Fi hotspot. It's not trusted, or it's being hosted inappropriately. The 1 in 10 that Diane has stated here really brings to the truth that you got to train people on this too. Don't take your laptop to an unknown location and connect, because that 1 in 10 statistic is real, especially with so many of us working remotely. Only connect to trusted networks, or networks that you know, even at home.
Yeah. No, thanks for that, Morey. I also want to get back to what you were talking about earlier, which is about the types of credentials, human credentials, machine credentials. We asked about that in the study too. And what you see here is actually the shape of this chart is almost, very similar to the shape of the last chart. You see one is way at the top. The employees, as you just mentioned, that's your weakest link here. But still, you do see those other areas having weaknesses as well. Your privileged users, it's a third compared to 75% of employees, but that information is usually so much more sensitive that's actually a very huge number. And again, you get right down to the bottom of the list, and even, your machine, Internet of Things, 12%, again, 1 in 10 saying that they've had that. So all of these are definitely weaknesses that need to be considered and risk managed.
It is an interesting piece. I like looking at the second one the most, because employees, look, every company has employees, right? Makes sense. But not every employee should be a privileged user. We've gone past the days that every user should have a privileged account. Now, granted, many organizations do still give secondary privileged accounts to users to make changes or do things that they need to, but I think the community recognizes that's not the best practice. Privileged users should only be a smaller subset. So to see that at 34% still makes me think that when we're managing identity type risks, and we have 34% of those identities having privileged users that have been the cause of those breaches, we're still not doing a great job. But that's something that's a bigger discussion than what we have here. Now, we talk about applications and partners. Okay, fine. Some applications do better with credential management than others, but that partner number is key. This is third parties we're allowing into our organization to do maintenance, professional services, any type of work that we're contracting out to. And we've seen this over the years, that vendor becomes the weakest link because their security controls are not up to snuff, and then they become the part of the breach. Service accounts, well, that makes perfect sense, because many times we set a service account password and we don't change it because we don't know what will break when we do change it, especially if we have that same credential across multiple resources using the same service account. You don't discover and link them all together and change them at the same time, inevitably something's going to break. And people come and go from that organization and that credential stays stale, we run into the problem, and that 25%. Now, the machine and IoT, even though, as Diane indicated, it's the lowest, is still incredibly relevant. We are going to see more machine and IoT devices in our businesses and our homes over the next coming years. That is a trend that has not let up. I do expect that number to increase significantly over time and become more of a liability as we work from home, because many home users don't even know that those credentials exist on their home systems. They potentially could be backdoored and then leveraged into our remote workforce, connecting into the corporate environment.
Yeah. So thanks for that, Morey. One last thing in this first part of our section, where we were just examining sort of trends on what's going on, we did ask these people, again, looking at that, within the last 2 years, have you had a breach? Think about that. Could you have done something to prevent it? I was this one kind of surprised. I found this finding really interesting. 99% said, oh yeah, we should have done better. We should have prevented that. We should have prevented that breach. Only 1%, look at this tiny, tiny little gray box at the bottom, said, nope, it was preordained. We couldn't have done anything to stop it. So the security and identity community thinks that they're preventable, these breaches. Now, and if you look at what they say could have prevented the breach, with the knowledge of 2020 hindsight, you see it's a mix, right? So there's some technology things, doing different technology, using your technology better. There's some, in-house expertise things, some process things, certainly look at number 2 there, getting those security and identity teams work together, which is what the IDSA is all about. But that number 1, better security training for users, 71% are saying, hey, let's train people. And Morey, I've got to ask you about this, because I think many people who are a little techie end up doing tech support for their parents. And I've been trying to get my parents not to click on links for a long time. And as you said, they're getting so much better. They look so real now. So how realistic is training in this day and age?
Training is the most important thing. And I think my peers replied in the same way that I would have replied in the survey. But what I found actually interesting, Diane, and you said it right at the beginning, 99% of people believe that breaches were preventable. That's a staggering omission from the community. It helps me, or makes me feel appreciative that people recognize we can do better versus being defensive. That 31% lower down, where purchase and deploy new technology, is also key. It's not the answer which we commonly hear, at least from the vendor community, go buy a product to solve a problem. It's not always the right answer. It truly is training. And that is in terms of identity governance programs, especially in terms of identity best practices, mover, joiner, leaver type practices, and identity governance for whether it's a privileged account or a standard user. If we can train people on what the best practices are for the entire life cycle, educate them on how to basically create accounts safely, provision them correctly, make sure we do not have shadow IT accounts, and they even train for things like phishing, we're going to do much better off of preventing these types of breaches. So don't take the training aspect as just, I'm going to train you not to click on a link. I'm going to train the entire organization to think better about what they can do. Now, the IDSA frameworks do help a lot in this context, giving you that guidance, but a lot of times things like regulatory compliance frameworks will help you as well. Just establishing, I do have a good program to basically onboard people, offboard people, and train HR and security teams to make sure that that process is working and auditable, to say, look, person left the organization, they didn't have accounts left over 6 months later, 10 years later. That sounds crazy. That's still all about training.
Yeah. Great. Well, you've given me a little hope, Morey, that maybe I can make some progress too with training my parents as well.
Maybe. I'm not sure. I don't have any luck at that at all.
That definitely makes me feel better. Let's shift gears here. Now we've talked a little bit about some of the trends and what we're seeing going on with identity-related security. Now let's talk about what is it that people are doing, what's happening, where are people putting their efforts, how are they doing? And to explore this area, we use as a baseline the IDSA's identity-defined security outcome. Now there's a lot of material that I know that just being released. This webinar isn't about that, and I know there's some great materials that Julie's going to talk about later. But what you need to know for the purposes of looking at this data is that we gave this definition to participants. So we said, hey, we're going to ask you about some identity-defined security outcomes, and what we mean is a desired result that's going to improve an organization's security posture through identity-centric security that will reduce the risk of a breach or a failed audit. So gave them this definition, used some little research magic to make sure that they caught their attention and that they read and understood it. And then we posed this question. And I know this is a busy slide, so stay with me. But we wanted to know for 8, this is a selection of 8, there's more than this from the IDSA, but we focused on these main 8 to explore what was going on. And we asked, here's a list of some identity-related security outcomes that your organization might be working on. How are you doing with that? What's your level of implementation? Are you done? Are you not even thinking about it? And just to get a sense of where people are with this. And what we found looking at this data, and again, there's a lot of detail here that we can break out, but I want everyone watching this webinar today to really take a look at those blue and brown colors in the middle, those people who are in progress and who are in planning, because that's where most people are, right? For most of these, you see that they're not fully implemented. In fact, it's less than half for all of them, except that very first one about privileged access rights being granted according to the principle of least privilege. That one, half said they were fully implemented. Everyone else is mostly, and I'm going to say there's not much red here. Very good news. People have identified these security outcomes as something too, and they're working on it, whether they have a plan or in progress. But really where you see most identity and security teams is they're in the middle, they're trying to figure it out, they're working on it, not quite there yet. So Morey, and actually, I want to make sure as we think about this, we remember that our survey here is of companies of 1,000 employees or more. So usually those larger companies are a little bit more mature in their security. I would fully expect this to be a little bit different if we included some smaller organizations. But Morey, I'm really curious about your take on this. And I'm particularly curious about your take. I talked about the blue and the brown. I'm curious about your take in the green. This was a survey, these people self-identified, and sometimes people think they do a better job than they actually are doing. What do you think? Is this realistic?
I think a lot of it is realistic, but I think there's some interesting nuggets here that you have to think about. Take that first item which you asked me about. Privileged access rights are granted according to the principle of least privilege. If we consider privileged access management as a sub-function of identity, which it is, 50% say that they fully implemented. Is that 50% across the entire organization? Probably not. Just for the crown jewels and the most sensitive systems? Yeah, that sounds right. And that's the way most people are going to think about it. Truth. Am I doing least privileged or privileged access management on my most sensitive systems? 50% said they're fully implemented, got it. But that model really should be extended across the entire enterprise. So it's a great thing to think about in terms of looking at the data and asking yourself, does everybody do it? Now, consider in the middle, all privileged access requires MFA, multi-factor authentication. Only 38% have it fully implemented. In my opinion, by far, that is the most effective method to stop credential type breaches of username password combinations. Only 38% have got it done. And you know what? 8% have no plans whatsoever. That to me actually scares me. That means 8% of companies don't see any value in adding a layer on top of a traditional username and password combination to prevent a threat actor from stealing, stuffing, using it, or any of the other vectors that we saw in the previous slide. So while the greens show promise and a lot of people are working on it, I have concern for many organizations that are not thinking about it and really can do a better job just in security basics.
Yeah, and Morey, as you were talking, I'm kind of wondering, are we seeing a sort of natural correlation there between, as we saw earlier, it's phishing and employees, they're at the top, but the outcomes that are kind of perhaps most likely to impact that, like MFA, as you mentioned, and also those two at the bottom, device characteristics and expected user behavior, are kind of the ones that maybe would help with phishing the most, and those seem to be really low in terms of the maturity.
They are low at the bottom. And when Julie did the introduction for us, and you were speaking about the data sets, this was all done in April. This was done at the beginning of the current remote workforce COVID-19 situation. And we've heard from a lot of vendors that they've had trouble adapting their technologies to use device characteristics now that people are working from home. Because basically you're not using your internal networks anymore to say, was the source IP correct? Or relying on traditional network security. We're thinking more along a zero trust line where there is no perimeter, where devices have to be able to authenticate and people need able to work wherever they are. So device characteristics are now a little bit blurred. The best we can do is actually check the user somewhat, but the device itself, but we can't even be sure that the device is on a secure network. So that makes that second to last bullet much harder. And I know for certainty, user behavior, look, in the current situation, many of our AI and ML models are just not working. We've changed user behavior over the last 2 months so much that we're getting a lot more false positives. They were not designed to have people jumping around when looking for different types of behavior. So those numbers at the bottom, I fully expect to be the lowest in the green, but also just a word of caution, in my opinion, that they're the hardest to do, considering as we've transitioned to a remote workforce.
Interesting. Yeah, no, it makes sense. So many things are harder these days, and especially this.
Yes.
But we won't go there. Let's move into instead our third, I think, hopeful part of this study, which is understanding, how does maybe doing better with these outcomes impact results? We wanted to really kind of understand, if the effort that security and identity teams putting into, does it pay off, right? What are the outcomes? Can we find data to understand this? And so one of the things we did is we asked our participants to think about the culture in their organization when it comes to identity-related security outcomes. And we asked them to put themselves in one of these buckets. And we broke them into, the reactive, the red over on the left, where, hey, we know these things are threats, let's really focus on responding to that. Or more, let's say, practical. We're thinking of our most likely attacks. We saw at the beginning, phishing and employees, we'll start there, right? And try and be very, very practical so that we know we're putting our efforts in the kind of, maybe one might think of this as an 80-20 approach. Or the people who are forward thinking, and they're really thinking about known as well as maybe unknown future risks when they're thinking through their security strategy. And I do want to say that these things were, of course, self-identified, but people, you look at this distribution, I think it looked pretty reasonable. About half put themselves in the middle. That almost always happens in research. And the remainder split themselves into kind of the less mature and more mature overall. So then what we wanted to do is once we had our audience in these buckets, we wanted to think about, well, what difference does that make in terms of their activities and in terms of their outcomes? And I thought this was really interesting. So let's go back to that IB leader matrix we just looked at and look at it again a different way. Let's think about those fully implemented people, right? So if we think about, we asked about whether you're fully implemented, in progress. Let's look at just fully implemented. And let's examine those according to our 3 buckets of maturity that we defined. And there's 2 things that I think really, really pop out when you look at this data. And the first is, of course, that the forward-thinking people are doing so much better with all of these outcomes. I mean, that green is just really tremendous on this chart compared to the browns and the purples of the practical and reactive people. So they're doing just far better. However, even the forward-thinking people, the most mature, aren't doing that great. You don't see any of these security outcomes being more than 2/3 of people saying they're fully implemented, even among the most mature. So I think there's a story here that, there's still work to be done, even for the people who are doing the very best at this problem.
And I think it's a really interesting set of statistics when you look at this. While you might think of forward-thinking, practical, reactive in terms of how you feel about things, also think of it as about early adopter or laggard. I don't want to say reactive is laggard, but reactive kind of matches up to that older analyst model where it's a problem and I need to react to go do it. And it kind of fits. But early adopter is not always forward-thinking. It's not always looking at the trends and going, I'm going to go do the latest thing to go fix it. It's kind of why when you see the statistics here, reactive and practical are really much closer in the majority of these items than the forward thinking. It makes you also think about it that the forward thinking teams may be going, look, we have had breaches, we are seeing attacks, there are things that are coming or we've experienced that we're going to have to tackle now. And it may not only be empirical, it may also be coming from the auditors. It may also be coming from other regulatory compliance findings. For example, auditors in the last couple of years have been reporting more and more that you have too many admin accounts. There's nothing wrong with that, but you have too many. Every user has a secondary account. Or you have too many people that have access to sensitive systems. Well, I have a large database team. Does everybody on the database team really need to have that access? And then you get into this forward-thinking approach of least privilege or being able to discover the privileges or something of that nature. So I'd like to think of the forward-thinking people as ones that are reacting, even though it's not reactive, but are managing what is being presented to them in terms of attacks or problem sets, where the practical and the reactive are going, you know what? We're going to get a fine. We better go do something. We've had a breach. And now they're really under pressure to solve these problems. And I think the graphs and the statistics from this actually hone in on that, that people are being forced more to handle it on the lower end versus people going, you know what? Let's make sure we get it done now. We're forward thinking, as we state, so it doesn't become a problem or another finding next year.
Yeah, no, I like the way that you package that. And I think that I really appreciated, Morey, you drawing that distinction between forward thinking and kind of early adopter. It's forward thinking in this case isn't about just doing latest and greatest, right? It's really a little bit more strategic view of the future. So I appreciated that distinction a lot.
Yeah, let's just look at something as simple as the MFA in the middle. Forward thinking, MFA is not forward thinking. However, forward thinking people know that if I do MFA, it will help me solve the variety of wide problems that I'm facing. And that's the best way to think about it.
Yeah, no, I like that. So then I think, to me, pulling this all together, the question that we have to ask is, okay, these forward-thinking people are doing better at these, outcomes. Well, what does that mean in terms of their overall security? And the good news is that this work that these forward-thinking companies are doing is definitely paying off. If you correlate that data back to the very first question that we asked in this study, which is, how long ago was it that you had identity-related breach? You see those forward-thinking companies are doing much better. Only a third, 34%, have had a breach within the identity-related breach in the past year, whereas those reactive companies, 59%, bumping up almost twice as likely to have a identity-related breach. So it does seem like these, the data shows that these efforts are paying off. And Morey, I really wanted your kind of anecdotally, do you see that as well? When you do the work, you're safer?
I see that from both sides of the house. I see that as the CTO in terms of product. I also see it in terms of being a CISO, that it is very much supportive of these statistics. For thinking about it in the simplest way, the first comment that I said to everyone on this panel was, identities are the lowest hanging fruit for a threat actor to basically attack. They're us. And there are so many different methods for them to do that. And as we've already discussed, social engineering, phishing being one of the easiest. If you're not thinking forward about how that training works, how to protect an identity, how that identity account relationship exists within an organization, whether that's human or machine or something new, and you're only reacting to the problem, you see the statistics like this with that 59% happening within the year. You have to think of every business is a target, every entity is a target, every organization is a potential target. All of us have a variety of PII, personally identifiable information, just from the people that we work with to even the payroll that company might support. And now we even have the laws from California CCPA and New York, being the New York Shield laws, making sure that all of that data is protected. And if there is some type of breach or incident, that we basically go ahead with public disclosure, or we have those penalties and fines. You do not want to be in that reactive bucket in protecting identities and protecting the data behind it. You need to be forward thinking now, because the penalties are so severe, so costly, they could potentially put a business out of business if we only deal with it in a reactive nature. So yes, these absolutely make sense, and companies need to start shifting from that reactive to more practical to forward thinking role. And again, doesn't mean an early adopter. It means recognizing the risks ahead of you and formulating a strategy to fix it.
Well, that's the data that we wanted to share with you today. If you are interested in what we've been sharing with you, the IDSA has made this report available. Julie will give you more information about how to access that. There's more in the report about the methodology, who we talked to, and some other questions we ask in addition to what we showed you here. Before we pass it, Julie, for a wrap-up, Morey, I want to give you the last word. Anything that I didn't give you the chance to touch on as we've been talking?
I think that one of the most important things for everyone to take away is identity is not an IT function. It's not a security function. It's an HR function as well, and it's an executive management function. If you manage identities across the top level executive team and have each department underneath own the responsibility and their proper slice of the pie, for lack of better terms, it's really actually fairly easy to implement and follow guidance to do it correctly. For example, you onboard a new individual. That is the responsibility of HR to make sure it is properly defined in terms of their roles, IT to implement, and information security to monitor. And as that person, as a joiner, moves throughout the organization or is promoted or goes on leave or exit the organization, all three departments work together in support of that identity. And you'll find that other identities, whether it's finance or whether that's payroll, all will interact to make sure it's properly managed. If we can do that, not only for the human aspect, but also the machine aspect, when an identity is needed as a relationship to an account or a project, we're going to do a lot better protected. So it's that forward thinking of identity management is more than just IT and IS problem. It's a company problem. And doing it correctly will fix a lot of these issues everywhere. These key findings will get so much better in the future that we'll now be looking, or threat actors will now be looking at other ways to potentially hack an organization, because we'll do so much better just managing identities in general.
Well, thanks so much, Morey. Pleasure talking with you about this subject. I really enjoyed that. Let's pass it over to Julie now. I know that there are some questions, I believe.
Yep. Thanks, Diane. Morey, that was great. So Morey, I think what you're saying there is that identity and security are actually a team sport.
Very much so. And
yeah,
there are other players.
Yeah, for sure. And I know that we did a survey, another study, back in December that did examine the alignment within organizations between identity, security, and the other players. And so for those on the webinar, there's additional research out there that supports that idea, and that those disconnects are creating challenges around protecting identities as well. So just a quick reminder, if you have any questions for Diane or Morey about the survey or anything else, or me about the IDSA, please enter them in the Q&A chat window. I did have just a couple of quick questions I wanted to pose, and Morey will take a question for you first. As a CISO driving your internal security strategy and the environment we're living in today, as we've talked about, very different than it was just 3 months ago. What's your key takeaway from this study, and what action would you take?
Well, that is a tough question. I think the biggest thing that we've done in terms of identities now working remotely in the last 3 months is ensuring that all access for those employees is being done from devices that are managed. It goes to one of those last statistics that you pulled up about how you're managing device characteristics. While we are typical, like most organizations that allows BYOD for tablets and phones, we frown upon that for laptops and computers that need management, that need patching, vulnerabilities, hardening, application control, etc. And we needed to verify that only the appropriate identity is on that machine and nothing coming in laterally that could impact the business. So as a recommendation to anybody that is experiencing the challenges of remote working, find ways to ensure that the person that is using that remote device is who they say they are. And you can pretty much say, yeah, I guess they are, but it's not necessarily them as the person. It's anything that could come underneath the hood, any type of lateral movement or other type of attack vectors that might be keystroke logging, or in that man in the middle attack case, compromising their identity or leveraging their identity. Because look, if your machine, even if its work is at home and it gets ransomware and you're VPN'd in, that's the conduit to infect other machines. So you got to make sure it's the right person and there's nothing else happening laterally that could impact them.
Great, thank you. Diane, from a security researcher perspective, and this is the second study that we've done, so I appreciate that and your expertise around this. Was there anything particularly surprising about these results?
Oh, that's such a good question. I think it's surprising, not the findings themselves weren't that surprising. I think that sometimes just how extreme they were, you know, as a researcher, we're always kind of looking at what are those places where there's, you know, 10, 20% or 80, 90% versus, you know, the stuff in the middle. And there were so many of these places where they're just big numbers. The number of breaches is just big. The, you know, focus on, like, you know, phishing was really at the top of that list. So I think that some of the largeness of the numbers, that's not a, you know, research specific statistics word, but I think explains really well some of my reaction to that. I think the other thing that I just not surprised me that I really loved about this study, and Morey touched on this a bit when we were presenting it, was the data around could you have prevented this, right? And, you know, this is my job. I spend my time doing research with, you know, IT and technology professionals. And I just love, there was no like, oh, it's not our fault, we couldn't have done anything. There was just the culture of ownership of, you know, knowing that there's something you can do and looking to do better is something that I think really comes through in this study and is something I enjoy so much about working with this audience.
Awesome, thanks. Okay, well, I think we'll wrap things up for today. I really appreciate your time today, Morey and Diane. It was a great discussion, and thank you so much for supporting and contributing to the IDSA.
You're very welcome.
So a couple of resources that I just wanted to point out. As Diane mentioned, the entire study is available on our website, so please check it out. We just reviewed a subset of the results of the survey, so please take a look at the white paper. There's a couple of additional blogs that support this. So the research shows how forward-thinking enterprises are preventing breaches is additional commentary. And then a blog by Asad Ali, who is our technical working group chair, digs a little bit more into the security outcomes that we talked briefly about and why this latest evolution of the framework is so important, which is the last, I think, graphic here is just showing you that there are 16 outcomes that are published to our website, securityoutcomes.idsalliance.org. So please take a look at those for more information about what we discussed today in the survey. And then lastly, I wanted to hit on a couple of upcoming webinars that support the activities that we've got going on. On June 4th, as I mentioned, Asad Ali is our technical working group chair, and IDSA board member Stephen Lee will be providing an overview of the latest iteration of the framework and how organizations can use it to drive their strategy and roadmap for achieving identity security outcomes. So make sure to register for that. And then following on to that, on June 18th, we'll kick off a series of deep dive sort of mini webinars or podcasts on Moch, where we'll be digging into each of the security outcomes, talk about the benefits and the various vendor neutral approaches to implementing. And Paul Lanzi, who is COO and co-founder of Remediant, will be kicking off that series of webinars. So lastly, thank you again for joining us today. As mentioned, you'll receive a link to the webinar recording that you can share with your colleagues or just relive this fun experience a second time. And we hope that you'll join us in our mission of bringing identity and security closer together. Thanks and have a great day and great Memorial Day weekend.
Thank you, Julie. Thank you, Diane. Be safe.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, bye.